Uruguayan Flight 571 was an unfortunate flight that crashed on October 13, 1972. It was traveling from Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay, to Santiago, the capital of Chile, carrying 45 passengers, including players of Uruguay's rugby team, their family members, and the flight crew. The journey was not very long. Normally, the trip from Uruguay to Santiago would take only 3 hours. However, the Andes Mountains lay in the way. The Andes mountain range in South America is the longest in the world, and after the Himalayas, it contains some of the highest peaks. These beautiful mountains proved disastrous for the passengers of our story. On that day, October 12, a storm was raging in the mountains, making it impossible for the aircraft to continue its journey. The pilots decided to make a stop along the way and resume the flight the next day. For the night, the plane landed in Mendoza, Argentina. The following day, on October 13th, the plane took off again. The pilots ensured that the weather was now clear. For the first hour, the flight was completely smooth. Then, the aircraft started to descend. It was nearing Santiago but was still flying over the mountains. Suddenly, violent turbulence shook the plane, causing it to sway left and right. Meanwhile, thick clouds surrounded the aircraft, obstructing the passengers' view. Suddenly, warning alarms started blaring, but no one understood why. The rugby players were not too alarmed, but one passenger looked out the window and saw that they were dangerously close to a mountain. As the clouds parted, the pilots realized they were heading straight toward a massive rock formation. Panicked, they immediately tried to pull the aircraft upwards, but it was too late. The rear section of the plane struck the mountain, completely breaking off. Passengers sitting in the back rows were thrown out of the aircraft. The plane managed to stay in the air for a few more moments, but then it began to plummet. Moments later, another violent impact tore off one of the wings, sending more passengers falling to their deaths. Now, only the front section remained, which crashed onto a snow-covered slope. It continued sliding at a speed of 350 kilometers per hour, before finally coming to a stop after falling 700 meters down. The aircraft was completely destroyed. Seats were torn from their places, the cockpit was crushed beyond recognition, and the pilots died instantly. The wreckage of the plane now lay on an unknown peak of the Andes, at an altitude of 3,570 meters. Astonishingly, 33 out of 45 people had survived. However, many passengers were badly injured, and no one knew where they were. Later, it was discovered that the plane had crashed 80 kilometers off its intended course, and so, the painful struggle for survival had just begun. Neither the survivors at the time nor we today could have anticipated what lay ahead for them. This is the chilling story of Uruguayan Flight 571. Immediately after the crash, 2 passengers who were not severely injured, 19-year-old Roberto Canessa and 20-year-old Gustavo Zerbino, began helping the survivors. Both were medical students and quickly assessed who was alive and who needed urgent medical assistance. They discovered that several passengers were in critical condition. Among them was 23-year-old Fernando Parado, who had fallen into a coma due to a fractured skull. The 2 students did their best to tend to the wounded. Meanwhile, within an hour of the plane's disappearance, Chilean air rescue services were alerted. 4 aircraft were dispatched to search for the survivors. They searched the area from evening until nightfall but found nothing. After analyzing radio transmissions, rescue officials concluded that the plane had crashed in a remote and inaccessible region. The remaining passengers used the wreckage of the plane as their shelter. They utilized whatever they could, seats, luggage, and snow, to seal off the back of the aircraft in an attempt to preserve some warmth inside. The survivors attempted to write SOS on the roof of the plane using lipstick, but they soon realized they did not have enough lipstick to complete the letters. Then, they tried arranging suitcases in the snow to form a large cross, hoping it would be visible from the sky. However, this method also proved ineffective. That day, they saw not 1 but 3 different planes flying over them. They shouted for help, waved their arms, and did everything possible to make their presence known. But none of the planes noticed them. Another day passed in the agony of waiting. The next day, on October 15th, the survivors realized that they needed water to stay alive. One of the passengers, Fito Strauch, discovered a way to obtain water. He used a metal sheet to concentrate sunlight and melt the snow, collecting the water droplets in empty bottles. Additionally, many passengers used seat cushions as makeshift shoes to walk on the snow, while the wool from seat covers was used to protect themselves from the cold. On October 16, 3 days after the crash, Fernando Parrado came out of his coma. Upon regaining consciousness, he saw that his mother had died in the crash, and his 19-year-old sister was severely injured. Parrado did everything he could to keep his sister alive, providing her with food and water. But as the days passed, on the 8th day after the crash, she succumbed to her injuries. 8 days after the crash, the search and rescue teams gave up. They believed that if no signs had been found within 8 days, there was no point in continuing the search. It was highly unlikely that anyone could still be alive after so many days. After 142 hours of searching, the operation was officially called off. Meanwhile, the survivors found a transistor radio in the wreckage of the plane. One of the passengers, rugby player Roy Harley, had an interest in electronics. He attempted to get the radio to work. He built a long antenna, and finally, the radio started functioning. By the 11th day after the crash, the survivors were running out of food. In reality, they had very little food from the beginning. Only a few pieces of chocolate, a single can, some almonds, a handful of peanuts, dates, a few dried fruits, and some bottles of wine. The radio was only one way, meaning they could listen but not send any messages. 11 days after the crash, they turned on the radio and learned that the search operation had been cancelled. Upon hearing this, their hearts sank. Some began crying loudly, while others raised their hands in prayer. A few days after the crash, they had started rationing food so that they could eat a little each day. But even with strict rationing, the food supply was nearly gone. At an altitude of 3,800 meters, there were no trees, no plants, and no animals that could be hunted for food. On the 11th day, all food had completely run out. Some people tried eating parts of the wreckage. They chewed on the fabric and leather from the seats, but this only made them feel worse. In such a dire situation, with no way to avoid starvation, the survivors made a decision that would shock anyone. To stay alive, they realized that their only option was to eat the bodies of the deceased passengers. This was an extremely difficult decision because the people who had died were their friends, teammates, and family members. We needed food, and the only thing left on the plane was, since the idea was first proposed by Canessa, he was the first to attempt it. A few others also tried but couldn't bring themselves to go through with it and refused. However, 2 days later, when there was no other option left, the remaining survivors finally accepted this grim reality. 16 days after the crash, even this source of food began depleting rapidly. Now they had no plan. No one knew what to do next. The situation had become dire, and then, that night, they heard a terrifying rumble. It was an avalanche. A massive amount of snow came rushing down the mountain and buried the wreckage of the plane. 8 people were buried alive under the snow and died. Now, only 19 survivors remained. These 19 people were also trapped beneath the snow. Parrado took a metal rod and tried to dig a hole in the snow to let air in. After 2 days of relentless effort, they managed to dig a tunnel through the snow and barely made it to the surface. As soon as they emerged, they saw that a snowstorm was approaching. So their best option was to take shelter inside the snow once again. For the next 3 days, the remaining survivors somehow managed to stay alive. 3 days later, they came out again, and the weather was completely clear. After stepping outside, the survivors realized that no one was coming to rescue them. If they wanted to survive, they would have to take matters into their own hands. There was no point in sitting at the crash site waiting for help. They had to make every possible effort to save themselves. Canessa, Parrado, and Vizintin were among the strongest of the group. They decided that these 3 should be given more food, the warmest clothes, and the responsibility of walking out in search of help. The first task was to estimate their location. Before the crash, the CO pilot had said that the plane had passed over Curacao. Based on this, they assumed that if they walked a few kilometers westward, they would reach the rural areas of Chile. But their estimation was completely wrong. In reality, the CO pilot had no idea where he was flying. In truth, the crash site was 89 kilometers to the east, deep in the Andes Mountains. But they were unaware of this fact. Therefore, they decided to rest for a few days to regain their physical strength. On November 15th, 33 days after the crash, the 3 of them set out in search of help. After traveling eastward for several hours, they found the rear section of their plane, the very part that had first separated from the aircraft during the crash. Inside, they discovered several suitcases, boxes of chocolates, 3 pieces of meat, a bottle of rum, extra clothing, and a few other items. Along with these supplies, they also found the plane's 2-way radio system, which could not only receive messages, but also send them. They decided to spend the night there. The next day, they traveled a little farther east, but after some discussion, they decided that they should try to get the aircraft's radio to work. Among the survivors was an 18-year-old young man, Carlos Miguel Rodriguez. He recalled that his mother had taught him how to sew, and he had a sewing kit with him. He thought that if he stitched different pieces of clothing together, he could create a large sleeping bag. They also planned to remove the plane's batteries from the main fuselage and use them to power the radio so they could send an SOS signal. They found a 24-kilogram battery in the tail section, but it was too heavy to carry back to the main wreckage. So they decided to try activating it right there. They returned to the crash site and sought help from Roy Harley, who had some knowledge of electronics. Unfortunately, the plan failed. The problem was that the aircraft's electrical system operated on 115 volts AC, while their battery was 24 volts DC. They had no way to connect them. To survive, they now had no choice but to walk westward. 59 days after the crash, another avalanche struck, killing 3 more people. The next day marked 2 months since the crash. The 3 brave men, Parado, Canessa and Vizintin, set out to climb the glacier without any mountaineering equipment. They still believed that they were only a few kilometers away from safety. So they hoped that if they walked for 2 to 3 days, they would find help. They packed food for 3 days. To protect himself from the cold, Parado wore 3 pairs of jeans, 3 sweaters, and 4 pairs of socks. He even wrapped a plastic bag around his feet to help retain heat. As the cold was unbearable, they had no technical gear, no map, no compass, and no experience in climbing mountains. At such a high altitude, the air was thin, making it harder to breathe due to the lack of oxygen. Despite this, they continued their climb. At night, the sleeping bag they had stitched together proved extremely useful. During the day, they slowly continued their journey. The 3 of them slept huddled together in the same sleeping bag and resumed walking as soon as the sun rose. On the 2nd day, then the 3rd, and by the morning of the 4th day, they realized that they had been completely mistaken. Ahead, where they had expected their journey to end, the mountain range still continued endlessly. Since their food supply was almost exhausted, Vizintin decided to return to the crash site so that the 2 remaining men could continue forward and consume less food. Vizintin began his journey back to the crash site, which was relatively easy as the path was downhill. He used a piece of the plane's seat cushion as a sled and reached the crash site in just an hour. What had taken them 3 days to climb only took an hour to descend. Meanwhile, Parado and Canessa continued their trek upward. 3 hours later, they reached the mountain's peak and saw that all around them were nothing but snow-covered mountains. As far as the eye could see, there was only endless snow. Struggling, Parado tried to spot something beyond the mountains. To the west, they saw 2 peaks that had no snow on them. They assumed that they should head in that direction. Now, they could not afford to give up. Parado and Canessa continued their journey through the mountains for several more days. Finally, they reached a valley where a river was flowing. This was a huge relief, as following a river made traveling relatively easier. They kept walking tirelessly. After 9 long days of travel, they began to see signs of human life. They spotted some cows grazing in the fields, but they were so exhausted that they could barely continue. Then, on the other side of the river, they saw a man riding a horse. "Look, there's a man on horseback." It wasn't just one person, it was 3 men riding horses. Parado shouted for help, but due to the roaring sound of the river, the men on the other side could not hear him. Fortunately, one of them spotted Parado and Canessa. He looked at them and shouted loudly, "Tomorrow," signaling that he would return the next day. The following day, the man returned on horseback, this time carrying some paper and a pencil. He tied the paper to a rock and threw it across the river using a string. This was the first time Parado had a chance to communicate with the outside world. Parado wrote in Spanish, "I come from a plane that crashed in the mountains." He explained that they were from Uruguay and had been walking for 10 days. He mentioned that their injured friends were still at the crash site and needed urgent help, but they themselves were too weak to continue any further. He requested assistance and asked where they currently were. On the other side, the man who read the message was a Chilean farmer named Sergio Catalan. He signaled to them that he understood their message. He discussed the situation with his two companions and remembered hearing news months ago about a plane crash. When they realized this connection, they were stunned. They could not believe that survivors were still alive from a disaster that had occurred 2 months earlier. Sergio threw a piece of bread across the river and immediately set off on horseback, riding continuously for 10 hours to find help. He was still far from any village or human settlement. Finally, when he reached the nearest town, he reported the situation to the military authorities and contacted the army headquarters in Santiago. Meanwhile, the farmers transported Parado and Canessa on horseback to Las Martenes, where they were finally able to rest. It was discovered that, purely through their willpower, they had walked 61 kilometers over the past 10 days. Canessa had lost nearly half his body weight and now weighed only 44 kilograms. As soon as the rest of the world learned about their story, the news spread internationally. The harrowing survival tale was almost unbelievable. The Chilean Air Force immediately dispatched 3 helicopters to rescue the remaining survivors. Military officers gathered information from Parado and Canessa to locate the crash site. Parado had brought the pilot's flight chart with him, on which he had marked all the locations they had walked through. The military commanders took Parado with them in the helicopter so he could personally guide them to the crash site. With his help, the rescuers were finally able to pinpoint the exact location of the survivors. On December 22, 1972, 70 days after the crash, 2 rescue helicopters arrived to save the remaining survivors. In total, 16 people were rescued. Their condition was extremely critical. They suffered from altitude sickness, severe dehydration, broken bones, and extreme malnutrition, but eventually they all recovered. This incident came to be known as the Miracle of the Andes.